Hello friends, Tattooed Biker here with you. And tonight's episode is a little different. Instead of multiple reports of anomalous activity and sightings, this time there's just one report. But this one, which starts in Tennessee and winds up in Alabama, involves multiple encounters with both strange creatures and another being that seems to almost be a MIB type figure. It's one of the most detailed and compelling accounts I've ever received. You don't want to miss this one. I've got a wild one in store, so grab your boots and let's ride.
Dear Tattooed Biker, hi. I've never sent this to anyone and I'm not sure where to begin, but I feel that I need to relay this story in case something happens to me. And I would appreciate it if you didn't use my name. I have even left information as a precaution that my brother may find if I were to suddenly go missing. Honestly, I'm really perplexed by this whole thing as I consider myself a big skeptic of things like this. And I wanted to write off this meeting that I had with this strange person about 12 years ago, because of something else that happened a couple of days ago, which I believe to be related to this guy. I feel the need to revisit the possibility of this being more than just an oddity. To put into perspective why I believe this man to be related to what happened to me recently, I need to give you a bit of background, and the first time that I believe that I encountered things associated with the guy. I am Southern and almost 30 years old now. The incident related to this man, who I call the Rancher, happened when I was 18, working my first real job. It was the fall of 2012 when I met the guy, but I believe that I may have come in contact with these things, which I now heavily associate with him, when I was just 10 years old. I lived in Tennessee for the first part of my childhood. There's a very small town outside of Knoxville where my grandfather had a farm. We'd visit regularly, and I would go and see the cows and chickens that he raised. We would pay him for meat sometimes when he was going to slaughter one of the cows and freeze it for meals that would last months. They also had corn and other crops there that he would harvest. His main source of income, though, was a retirement from the military, and he had several sheds and workshops where he would fix discarded appliances and vehicles and then sell them. The first incident in question was during the summer of 2004 on his farm. I was actually out playing with one of their border collies while my granddad was out in the field feeding the cattle. The farm is in the hills of this area. It's part of the Smoky Mountains, and the farm was quite large. I don't know how large off the top of my head, but large enough that it had big fields and a smaller area for crops, and his property encompassed a very large portion of the surrounding wooded areas. Me and the dog, who was named Sweetie, wandered up into the wooded area a bit during the time that he was out feeding the cattle. I was alone, except for Sweetie, when this occurred, and I was so young at the time that the memory was, and still is, a bit fuzzy. But the important part is still very clear. During this particular excursion into those woods, me and Sweetie came across what I can only describe as a large tree with a hole beneath it. As we came up on this hole, I looked down into it, and I couldn't see the bottom. It was pitch black. For the longest time, I thought that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I now believe that what I saw then was real. My head started almost buzzing, and I felt my hair stand on end. I started shaking, but I couldn't look away from it. I felt like if I started to run that I would die. It's really hard to describe the sensation, but I would call it an impending sense of dread. Eyes were looking back at me from this hole, but I couldn't see the body at first. And then I saw what looked like a smile in the very small body of this humanoid-looking thing. The body was entirely black, like freshly laid asphalt, almost unnaturally black. I mean, it was like looking into the absence of light itself. The only light portions were the eyes and eventually the mouth when it kind of smiled at me. And I felt like I was going to die just looking at it, but I still couldn't run away. After that, it's like I can't remember exactly what happened, and my next memory is me walking back for dinner. I should also tell you that we couldn't find Sweetie after that, and I felt so bad because, well, I really love that dog. I didn't tell anyone what I saw because I didn't want them to think I was crazy or demon-possessed or something. My family is very religious, and I'm not anymore since my teens, but I was raised as a very fundamentalist Christian, so as a young girl I was very much convinced that Satan and demons were very real. And over time this memory just kind of faded, and I ended up thinking that I either dreamed this or I was simply remembering things wrong. Fast forward to 2007, I was 18, almost 19, and it was the fall of that year. I was working at my first real job while attending college for computer science. Keep in mind, by this time, I was totally unreligious. I didn't believe in anything supernatural, extraterrestrial, or anything remotely paranormal. I was an avid reader of prominent atheists, such as Richard Dawkins. My job was at a bookstore. It was a chain of bookstores that I think are mostly regional to the south. At this point, we had moved to Alabama and had been living in that state for almost 9 years. I had actually just gotten a promotion to work at the store's joint coffee shop as a barista, but I also still sometimes worked the register or did some stocking. The first time I encountered this man, that I refer to as the rancher, I was actually working the front cash register. I often worked the late shift there, which was from 4 p.m. to 12. We would start closing at around 11:30 though, and I did most of that by myself, as it was usually just me and one of the assistant managers and a barista for the coffee shop there that late. It was around 11 p.m. and this guy comes in, and I immediately got a strange feeling about him. The reason that I call this guy the rancher is that he dressed like a cowboy, straight out of a Western film or even a rodeo. I had family in Texas, so I had been to rodeos before, and I mean, this guy was just very strange to be walking into a bookstore at 11 p.m., decked out in snakeskin cowboy boots, a hat, and Western-looking clothes. I thought at first he was just a tourist or something, and went back to reading. I read books in the evenings because, well, we don't get a lot of people buying books that late, and we mostly stayed open because there are lots of groups that like our coffee shop, and I guess they made money off it being open that late. Well, this guy walked to the back at some point for a good 20 minutes, and then when I was about to make a closing announcement, like I usually do, he came up to the counter with 4 books. I thought that the selection was a very strange mix of material. One of them was a physics book, one was an automotive manual, one was something about New Age religion, and the other was about martial arts. I honestly don't remember the specific titles because, well, what really stuck out about the event was the guy. I could barely look away from him while I was helping him check out. I just started getting this feeling that something about this guy's body was, well, fake. His skin was very pale, not out of the realm of possibility, but very unusual. In fact, he was the whitest man I'd have ever seen, without being an obvious albino. The other thing was his eyes. They were beady, like they almost looked like glass eyeballs. Like maybe he was wearing contacts, but it was really hard to tell exactly why they looked that way. He smiled at me the entire time, and it was more than just a friendly grin. It almost felt like a flirtation or something. At the end, when I'd finished ringing him up and bagging his books, I realized that he hadn't said anything to me. and I had been making my usual niceties that I like to think of as customer service, but at the end, he stopped for a minute and stared at me before leaving, and then he asked, "What did you say your name was?" Now, I thought this was really bizarre at the time because, well, number one, I had a name tag on, and number two, I had never told him my name during the conversation at all. But for some reason, he acted like I did, and he had just forgotten. I told him my name, and he said, "Oh, what a nice name that is. I'll have to ask for you if I return here." At this point, I just thought this guy was hitting on me or something. He was really creepy, and I just wanted him to leave as soon as possible. And thankfully, he did. Unfortunately, I would see him one more time, about 3 weeks later. It was late again, a little after 10 p.m., and this time I was actually working in the coffee shop. I was making some drinks for a group of students that came in to do a study group, or a club or something. And when I turned around to start giving them their order, I realized the rancher guy was back, standing behind them. He was in the exact same cowboy-like attire, and he was standing almost unnaturally still, just looking up in my direction with that same weird smile. I felt this weird sense of dread wash over me, and I was suddenly reminded of the memory from my childhood because that was the only other time that I'd had that type of sensation. The students eventually left, and he came up and ordered. He said that he wanted a bottle of milk from our mini fridge. I got it for him, and he paid. I watched as he stood there, opened it, and started drinking it. And then he paused and said, "It's good, but missing something." He drank half the bottle, and I watched him go over to our cafe area, where we had creamer sitting out for people's coffee, and he proceeded to pour creamer into the bottle until it was nearly full again. And then he resumed drinking, and he drank the entire thing, in one continuous gulp without breathing. He then left to go into the store where the book racks are. I was hoping he had left by the time that I took my evening break. Not long after, I made myself a drink and went to sit at one of the tables in our adjoined patio area. This was at 11 p.m. because that's the time I usually took my evening break when I was working at the coffee shop. I was just sitting there, reading my book and trying to enjoy my drink after that unnerving experience, and then I heard our patio door open. And there he was, the rancher guy again. I realized I was cornered, and he sat down at my table, directly across from me. He sat motionless, but had that weird smile, and he took off his hat and laid it on the table. And that's when I realized that this guy was also bald, and his scalp looked very strange, like it had never had hair at all. It was almost like rubber. It all was very odd. I asked if I could help him find something, thinking maybe he was just being creepy and trying to hit on me. He said my name rather calmly, and then the conversation got really strange and specific. He said, "I'm actually here because you are one of my tasked individuals. I don't really know why you're on my list for this area, but you are. And I like you, so I'm going to be frank with you. I'm not entirely human." I paused at this point, and I had that feeling of dread again, even more than before, and I was like crawling out of my skin at this point. I actually panicked and got up. As I did, he said my address, and then I froze, realizing this guy knew where I lived and who I was. He said, "Sit down. You're making this difficult." And then he told me that I'm not going to hurt you. That's not my job. My job is to simply keep track of individuals that I've been tasked with. That is all. And I need to ask you a few questions to make sure there aren't going to be any problems. He started smiling again, and it was almost like a forced smile. He looked fake, and he looked so strange, but I sat down because this guy had threatened me at my home, and I didn't know what else to do other than to see what he wanted with me, and maybe get some more info on the guy so maybe I could call the police after he left. He said, "I'm actually from a certain organization that manages many things here on this planet, and I'm what you would call a liaison between your kind and them. I'm partially them, but I'm mostly one of you, and so I'm tasked with direct, prolonged communications with your type. He then proceeded to ask me some questions about whether or not I had ever seen anything out of the ordinary, and who I might have told about it. Obviously, he meant other than him because I remarked that he was freaking me out, and asked if this was some kind of prank. I finally told him about my memory from when I was a kid and told him that I hadn't told anyone about it at all. He remarked that that would likely be the reason that I was on his list. He also asked me a few other questions, seemingly unrelated. He asked me what I was studying in school and where I thought I might work after I graduated. He seemed interested if I was considering military contractor work, and also asked about some of my family members' military service. In between each question, he paused for a good 20 to 30 seconds, and I asked him what he was doing after the third time this happened, and he said that he was scanning my possible timelines for confirmation. He told me that his kind could actually see different spectrums, and that he was having this conversation with multiple versions of myself, and that he was making sure that none of them were going to become a problem for him because he hated having to return. After a few more questions, he gave that smile and said, "All done." He got up and said that people weren't likely to believe me, but that I shouldn't talk about the small black creatures that I encountered, or I could meet with someone else from his organization with a different designation, and that it may not end as nicely for me. After this, I didn't see the rancher guy again, and I tried to forget the event as best I could. I actually ended up going to therapy for this, though I didn't give the therapist any specific details about the encounter. She helped me greatly, and I was able to finish school. I work as a software engineer now, and I've not had any strange occurrences for the last 12 years. This year, I adopted a Dachshund puppy. He's really sweet, and he's about 7 months old now, and we like to play outside in the afternoons. A few days ago, I was on my porch relaxing when I hear him growling. I had actually never heard him growl before at anything. He's barked before, but never growled. I rushed over to see what was wrong because I thought maybe he had found a wild animal or something. But he was growling at the gap beneath my wooden deck. I looked under there, moving him to the side, and I saw a small dark figure and eyes. I snatched up my pup and I ran back upstairs and inside and locked all the doors. I'm very upset and anxious over this, and I've been losing a lot of sleep. I even had an exterminator come out, and he said that he couldn't find anything, even after I begged him to look the whole area over twice and told him that I thought maybe mice or something were under my deck. He still found nothing, and that's why I'm sending this story anonymously, but also in a public forum, so there's a record. I'm extremely afraid that I might be visited by that bizarre man or someone associated with him, and if for some reason I go missing, I have set an automated delivery message to go to my brother if I'm absent for more than a month. Godspeed, and I hope none of you have ever encountered this guy or any of his people. Thank you. Signed, Anonymous.
Quick narrator's note here. Well, I was fascinated by this account, and I responded to the witness with, as you can imagine, a myriad of questions, asking for more detail, and she responded in the following email.
Hey Biker, thank you for responding, and as for your questions, well, first off, the small creatures were less than a foot tall if I had to guess, maybe only 8 or 9 inches. Their bodies were the color of crude oil. I mean, it was like looking into a black hole. Their eyes were bright, but I can't tell you exactly what color they were. It's really weird. It was like their eyes were mechanical, almost. and had these little darting lights inside them. Their shape was very odd. It was almost eggplant-shaped. I mean, that their torsos were wide, and their heads were small, and they had small, thin arms and legs. The neck was strange. It's like they didn't have one, like the body just curved up into the head in one continuous body. They also had very strange mouths. I remember thinking they looked like human mouths, but they didn't move like a human's mouth. It's like they moved on the surface of their body with no or very little muscle movement. And for the rancher himself, I kind of stopped thinking of him as human. In fact, I almost got the sense that this thing's face wasn't actually real and that it was making me see that intentionally. It's partially why I felt so upset just looking at it. It looked like it was peering into my mind. And the first time when I was there was definitely buzzing sensations. It wasn't a seizure. I'm almost certain of that because I've never experienced seizures during any other portion of my life. No one has ever witnessed me having such an attack or episode. The other reason is because I was in therapy for several years after my encounter with the rancher guy and was treated for anxiety. The psychiatrist I ended up seeing said that I had a form of PTSD, and they subjected me to testing. They ruled out several things, including mood disorders and seizure disorders, and I was eventually able to cope with therapy and didn't have to permanently stay on anxiety medication. Honestly, meeting that guy was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And the reason I wanted to finally tell my story here is that I'm so extremely terrified of him and whatever his people might be. As for the rancher guy as well, I got the distinct sense that he was serious when he said that he wasn't entirely human, but mostly human. He said rather specifically that he was more human than some others in this organization, and that's why he had the job that he did. Mostly, he seemed to be rather matter-of-fact about the whole thing, but he was definitely withholding stuff. I asked him questions like why he was doing this and things like that, and what he really wanted. He didn't answer most of my questions. It seemed like the stuff he did tell me was just to keep me calm and on that patio talking to him until he finished with whatever it was he was doing. He asked me about 3 specific topics: what I had seen or experienced that was unusual, which of my family members were in the military, and what did their service entail. There are several, but I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to accidentally identify them or me here. The last one was the strangest to me. He said, "Where do you think you'll be working when you graduate? And what do you hope to work on?" And he specifically wanted to know if I was considering contractor work of any kind. During these periods, he would stop for a good 30 seconds or so before continuing. He would shut his eyes and I could see them moving under his eyelids, but it was really strange looking, and they were moving rather fast in different directions. And I was getting very unnerved during these periods because I kept looking at him. The more I looked at him, the more I felt like he looked fake or something other than human. He was human looking enough to make people not really give it a second thought, but when I was up close talking to him for that extended period, it was very unnerving because I almost felt like his face wasn't real, and his scalp looked like rubber or plastic. That's when I asked him what he was doing, and he would rather calmly explain that he was scanning my timelines and speaking to different versions of myself, and that he could see spectrums, and that we could not. It was like a semi-explanation. It wasn't a normal conversation at all. It was not even like a conversation you might have on a plane with someone sitting next to you. I felt like I was being interrogated, but he also didn't say very much, other than asking the questions and giving a few brief explanations when I started to get panicked. As for how long we talked, I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I never really thought about it. I know that it was able to close up after, but as I left as quickly as possible, telling my manager that I was feeling very nauseous and asked if I could leave a bit early after I closed the cafe. I also asked him if he had seen that guy. And he asked, "The OK Corral guy?" And I said yes, and then he said, "Yeah, that guy was asking me about a book, and I had never heard of it, and couldn't find it in our system. Something called the Lexicon of Time. He said it was something from the 60s, and he had been trying to find a copy for years." This was really strange because we're not that kind of bookstore. We're like a chain store that carried books from publishers, not like a specialty or rare bookstore. The manager told him that we didn't have it, and the guy said nothing and walked off. And he also had this weird feeling about him, so he kept looking up at him to make sure that he wasn't trying to steal stuff. That was until he came over to the bar. He clearly didn't see him talking to me, because he asked if that weirdo had left. We did have weird figures come in there sometimes. We had a woman yelling about Jesus and the apocalypse in the store about a month prior. She was bipolar, it turns out, and we called the paramedics and had her trespassed. That is also part of the reason that I just tried to write this off for so long, as him being just another weirdo customer. If anyone has ever seen someone like this man, or these black creatures before, please post in the comments. If there is any information about how to get rid of these things, or keep them from following me, well, I'd really like to know, because I feel like I'm crawling out of my skin. I looked under the porch this evening with a giant mag light that I bought on the way home. I can't see anything there unusual. For now, though, I'm not letting my dog out in the yard without me, and I'll be taking him for more walks. I just seriously hope that these things don't return, whatever they are. Thanks. Signed, Anonymous.
One last narrator's note before I leave you. I believe this witness because I have heard and read similar encounters over the years researching unexplained events. I initially thought that this encounter was a parallel to MIB incidents, and although I still believe that is the case, I also feel that this hybrid being was possibly bioengineered for a specific purpose, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on the matter.
And there it is. All I have for you tonight. If you enjoy this type of content, real reports of unexplained events from real viewers, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notifications. And if you yourself have a strange experience or unexplained encounter that you'd like to share, just send it to the email address in the description, and your story may just wind up in a future video. Anyways, thanks so much for riding with me tonight. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker, out.